Welcome to Parliament Through Time podcast. I hope you are all well and safe. This podcast is about the origins, development and current practices of the institution of Parliament in Europe and the Middle East. Each week we will deliver an overview of certain key topics to enhance our understanding of parliamentary life, what lessons we have learned from the past events, and how these lessons learned can be applied to today's practices. Last week, we dealt with the restoration of parliamentary democracy in the Central and Eastern Europe in the last decade of the 20th century. This week, we are turning our attention to the Arab world by analysing the parliamentary development in the Middle East and North Africa regions after the Arab Spring. The podcast series is produced by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the framework of the European Union-supported Jordanian House of Representatives programme. Marko Vujacic, the committees and oversight expert in the programme, prepared the content of the podcast. I am Lama Sawi, your host for this podcast from the heart of Amman, Jordan. Arab Spring was the wave of pro-democracy protests and uprisings that took place in the Middle East and North Africa in the end of 2010 and beginning of 2011. It was a series of events of rare intensity in Middle Eastern history, as mass popular and largely non-violent revolts, which challenged some of the region's authoritarian regimes. In the Western media, it was largely branded as the region's 1989 moment, referring to the pro-democracy changes triggered by the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, which we addressed in the previous episode. While no single pattern captures all post-uprisings developments across the region due to their originality and diversity, today we will focus more on Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, and Egypt, as these four examples would allow us to capture key differences in outcomes of the protests. How did it start? In January and February 2011, protests in Tunisia and Egypt succeeded in a matter of weeks in toppling two regimes thought to be among the region's most stable. The first demonstrations took place in central Tunisia in December 2010, catalyzed by the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor protesting his treatment by local officials. A protest movement dubbed the Jasmine Revolution in the media, quickly spread through the country. The Tunisian government attempted to end the unrest by using violence against street demonstrations and by offering political and economic concessions. However, protests soon overwhelmed the country's security forces, compelling President Ben Ali to step down and flee the country in January 2011. Disorder lingered in Tunisia in the days after Ben Ali's departure. Protests continued, with many objecting to the participation of Ben Ali's regime politicians in the interim government. There were also sporadic outbreaks of violence that many Tunisians attributed to Ben Ali's loyalists, attempting to sow unrest in the country. Tunisians voted on the 23rd of October 2011 to determine the composition of the 217-member Constituent Assembly, a new body with a mandate to appoint an interim cabinet and draft a new constitution. With voter turnout at nearly 70%, the moderate Islamist Ennahda party emerged as the clear victor, winning 90 seats with more than 40% of the vote. The election, the first since the ouster of Ben Ali, was described by observers as free and fair. The Constituent Assembly met for the first time in the late November and approved an interim constitution in early December. The Assembly also elected Monsef Marzouki, a human rights activist and former opponent of the Ben Ali regime, as president of Tunisia. President Marzouki then appointed Hamadi Jebali, a member of Ennahda, to the post of Prime Minister. In Egypt, massive protests broke out in the late January 2011, days after Ben Ali's ouster in Tunisia. The Egyptian government also tried and failed to control protests by offering concession while cracking down violently against protesters. After several days of massive demonstrations and clashes between protesters and security forces in Cairo and around the country, a turning point came at the end of the month when the Egyptian army announced that it would refuse to use force against protesters calling for the removal of President Hosni Mubarak. Having lost the support of the military, Mubarak left office on the 11th of February 2011 after nearly 30 years, ceding power to a council of senior military officers. However, optimism was dampened when the new administration appeared hesitant to begin a full transfer of power to an elected government, and when military and security forces resumed the use of violence against protesters. Confrontations between protesters and security forces became frequent occurrences. In spite of multi-day outbreak of violence in late November 2011, parliamentary elections proceeded as scheduled. When voting was concluded in January 2012, it was clear that the elections had been dominated by Egypt's Islamist groups. The Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party won about 47% of the seats in the assembly, and the hardline Noor Party won about 25%. Newly elected National Assembly held its inaugural session in late January 2012. Egyptian politics was shaken up again in June of 2012 by a series of developments denounced by Islamists and political liberals as a soft coup, carried out by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. The council intended to retain power and prevent Islamists from gaining control of the legislative and executive branches of government. Just days before the presidential runoff on the 16th and 17th of June 2012, the Constitutional Court unexpectedly invalidated the results of the legislative elections held in 2011 and 12, forcing dissolution of the Islamist-dominated National Assembly. The action was followed on the 17th of June 2012 by a surprise constitutional declaration by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, expanding its authority and placing new restrictions on the powers of the incoming president. Egypt was without a parliament for more than 3 years afterwards. It was not until the end of 2015 when the new elections for the Egyptian House of Representatives were held. Meanwhile, on the 24th of June 2012, Mohamed Morsi was declared the winner of the presidential election, and he took office at the end of the month. His presidency, however, did not last for a long time. Despite the efforts to pass a new constitution, which was finalized in December 2012, the opposition to Morsi's presidency mounted. The Islamists' strong performance in parliamentary elections had allowed them to gain a dominant position in the First Constitutional Assembly, a 100-member body tasked with drafting the constitution. On November 30th, 2012, the Constitutional Assembly approved a draft constitution without the input of the boycotting Christian and secularist members. The adoption of the constitution itself became the stage for bitter contention between the Islamists and a loose opposition comprising of liberal, secular, and Christian factions. Sporadic violent protests against Morsi's rule continued in early 2013. On the 1st of July 2013, a year after the Morsi's election, Egypt was again on the brink of a major economic and political crisis, with fresh protests erupting in the streets. The head of the Egyptian armed forces, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, declared that the military was ready to intervene to prevent chaos in the country if the two sides were unable to resolve their differences within 2 days. Morsi responded to the protests by offering negotiations with the opposition, but refused to step down. Protests continued, and on the 3rd of July 2013, the military made good on its ultimatum, temporarily suspending the constitution and removing Morsi from the presidency. In September 2013, the interim government set out to transition back to a constitutional government. It appointed a committee to amend the constitution written in 2012 by the Islamist-dominated Constitutional Assembly. The new constitution allowed elections to be held in May 2014, strengthening the role of the executive. A new House of Representatives was elected in end 2015. It has various competences stated in the Constitution, such as to review and approve of agreements and treaties, review and approve the state plan and budget, debate the Presidents of the Republic statement and the government program, amend the constitution, approve of declarations of war and state of emergency. The new Parliamentary Elections Law, promulgated in June 2014 and partially amended in December 2015, establishes a mixed electoral system. A total of 568 seats will be elected in a form of parallel voting. 284 of them will be elected using a two-round system in 142 constituencies, each electing 2 members, and the other 284 will be elected using party lists in 4 constituencies. Both political parties and independents can run for both the single-member and list seats. MPs must be Egyptian, must be at least 25 years old, and must hold an education certificate. The House sits for a 5-year term, but can be dissolved earlier by the President. All seats are voted on in each election. Historically speaking, the Egyptian House of Representatives wielded little powers and was often subordinate to the executive power, namely the powers of the President. Under 2014 Constitution, the House of Representatives is entrusted with the authority to enact legislations and approve the general policy of the state, the general plan of economic and social development and the state budget. It exercises oversight over the actions of the executive power. The return to a more dominant position of the President only reinforced such position. For the time being, it seems that the Egyptian society and political elite prefer such balance. Although Tunisia's transition process was considered less turbulent compared to Egypt's, it was not without challenges. Agreeing on the kind of political regime, for instance, proved to be a continuous issue at all stages. On the one hand, the Ennahda movement pushed for a parliamentary system with a prime minister at the center of political power, based on the German or British model. On the other, political parties like the Congress for the Republic and the Progressive Democratic Party were inclining more toward a French-style semi-presidential system. The 2014 Constitution adopted a semi-presidential system along the French model, but with the difference that the presidential appointment of the Prime Minister must be done in consultation with the Parliament. The Prime Minister also enjoys significantly more powers in comparison to the French model. The Prime Minister appoints all government ministers, except those for defense and foreign affairs. The President has exclusive control over these 2 ministries. The Prime Minister presides over the administration and negotiates international agreements of technical nature. The Council of Ministers is called by the Prime Minister, who fixes the agenda. Overall executive authority is exercised by the President of the Republic, who is the head of state, representing its unity, securing its independence and continuity. The President of the Republic is elected by general, free, secret and direct elections. Legislative power is vested in a unicameral assembly of representatives. Members are elected by universal suffrage for a term of 5 years. Members enjoy parliamentary immunity but are subject to arrest in case they are caught in criminal act. Voting in the assembly is personal and may not be delegated. The Assembly can impeach the President for grave violations against the Constitution, on the initiative of a majority of its members. In other countries of the Middle East and North Africa region, such as Morocco, Parliament also gained more prominence in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. As in Egypt and Tunisia, political protests arose in Morocco in 2011, demanding political reforms, placing more power in the hands of elected representatives. In order to address the demands of the protesters, King Mohammed V appointed a commission of experts who drafted a new constitution in consultation with political parties, unions, businesses, and human rights organizations. The new constitution was passed by referendum on the 1st of July 2011. The 2011 constitution strengthened the power of the government, but the king still maintains significant executive authority. It maintains Morocco's character as a constitutional monarchy, placing the executive power in the hands of the monarch, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, while the legislative authority is held by a bicameral legislature. The Parliament is divided into two chambers, the House of Representatives and the House of Councillors. Members of the House of Representatives are elected by direct vote for 5-year terms, and the number of its members is determined by law. By contrast, the House of Councillors may not exceed 120 members elected by direct vote to 6-year terms. 3/5 of these councillors represent the territories and regions in proportion to their populations, while the remaining 2/5 are elected in each region by electors composed of politicians, representatives of professional organisation of employers and workers. The Parliament meets twice a year, though it may be convened by the majority of its members by special decree to address a constitutional revision, hear a declaration by the Prime Minister, discuss the presentation of the budget, or listen to a national address by a foreign head of state. The Parliament votes on laws and controls the actions of the government. It has the authority to address questions concerning fundamental rights, the status of the family and civil rights, the rules of the healthcare system, and the regulation of the media. In addition, the Parliament may legislate on issues of amnesty, the organisation of the judiciary, the judicial procedures, electoral laws, the national budget and financial matters, national and public transportation. Issues related to work and social security, the protection of the environment, the education system, and other matters relating to the administration of the nation are also under the Parliament's purview. Normally, the House of Representatives is given priority to address legislation. However, in matters relating to the development of the regions or social affairs, the House of Councillors has precedence. Both houses have the chance to review a law and make changes before a final vote. And a law is passed if an identical version of a law manages to gain a majority vote of the two chambers. In Jordan, after several years of strong economic performance, the global economic recession in 2008 caused growth to slow down. In January 2011, following massive anti-government demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt, thousands of Jordanians attended rallies in Amman to protest against high prices, unemployment, corruption in the public sector, and to less extent the lack of democracy in Jordan. The crowds focused much of their anger on Jordan's Prime Minister, Samir Rifa'i, and his government. The government responded to that popular discontent by announcing a package of subsidies for basic goods. Measures, however, did little to placate critics, and protests continued. On the 1st of February 2011, King Abdullah II dismissed the government and appointed new Prime Minister, Ma'ruf Bakhit. In an official statement, the king tasked Bakhit with introducing political reforms and improving living conditions for all Jordanians. Weekly pro-reform demonstrations continued in spite of the change of the government. Dozens of demonstrators were injured in clashes with police. The Jordanian government, eager to appear responsive to protesters' concerns, continued to announce reform initiatives. In April 2011, the king appointed a 10-member royal committee to propose constitutional reforms, and a speech delivered by the king in June promised to strengthen Jordan's electoral democracy. Without much public consultation, the package of constitutional amendments based on the royal committee's proposals was passed by the parliament in mid-September and approved by the king. In October 2011, King Abdullah dismissed the cabinet for the second time in a year, replacing Bakhit with Aoun Khassaoune as prime minister. Khassaune's tenure lasted 6 months, and his immediate successor has lasted 5. A new electoral law, passed in June 2012, was criticized by the opposition figures for retaining the aspects of the old voting system that gave disproportionate weight to districts where support for the government was highest. When King Abdullah called early parliamentary elections for January 2013, some parties decided not to participate. The elections produced the new House of Representatives dominated by independent MPs, who were mostly supporting the government. In his book on the Jordan and the Arab uprisings, Author Curtis Ryan argues that after years of struggle over elections, citizens' demands shifted to the nature of Parliament itself. Many Jordanians viewed Parliament as unsuccessful. Therefore, there seemed to be agreement that in addition to electoral reform, Parliament too needed to change and become a more genuine legislative body, which employed changes regarding the nature of government, of governance, and of the balance of power in the state itself. Ryan writes that some pro-democracy activists agree on the set of demands that would turn Parliament into the body that actually legislates rather than simply passes cabinet initiatives or royal decrees. Consequently, the government should be drawn from elected representatives of the people, and Jordan should become a truly parliamentary system. In response to these demands, King Abdullah issued a series of discussion papers outlining his vision of reforms that would lead to transition from the royal to parliamentary government. The discussion paper, Making Our Democratic System Work for All Jordanians, was issued in January 2013, and it outlines the key principles of the new democratic system, the transition to a true parliamentary government, and sets conditions for such transition. The king stated that the fundamental principle of modern democracy is that the people elect representatives to make important public decisions on behalf of the country as a whole. As countries have developed their democratic systems, a variety of models have emerged for the implementation of this democratic principle. In a constitutional monarchy, the king notes, the government is formed from the elected majority party or coalition of parties in the parliament. The king noted that Egypt and Tunisia are evolving republics, while Morocco, like Jordan, is a constitutional monarchy. He clearly pointed out that the next stage in evolution of Jordanian constitutional monarchy is determining the manner it selects the government. The king writes, "As I have said before, the path towards deepening our democracy lies in moving toward parliamentary government, where the majority coalition in parliament forms the government. As a first step, we will change how the Prime Minister is designated after this upcoming election. The new Prime Minister, while not necessarily an MP, will be designated based on consultation with the majority coalition of parliamentary blocs." The king also stated the conditions for a successful transition to parliamentary government. The emergence of true national parties that aggregate specific and local interests into a national platforms and programs, and then form solid parliamentary blocs. The increase of capacities of the public administration to further develop its professional, impartial, non-political abilities to support and advise the ministers. The change in parliamentary conventions and the way parliament works. These conventions will guide the formation of governments through consultation and consensus among parliamentary blocs. This will require shared understanding of how such blocs agree on common policy platforms as a basis for cooperation and stable government. Opposition parties will similarly need to agree on conventions for how they cooperate in holding the government to account and offer an alternative vision, as the king recognizes their role is just as crucial for successful government. The examples of 4 countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, and Egypt, show key differences in outcomes of Arab Spring, especially when it comes to the democracy and parliamentary development. Authors Andrea Titti, Pamela Abbott, and Francesco Cavatorta, in their edition, The Arab Uprisings in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, Social, Political, and Economic Transformations, attempted to explain why different outcomes occurred in similar situations. Tunisia undertook a path towards consolidating democracy and human rights after the Jasmine Revolution, however precariously, and is generally viewed as the country to have successfully consolidated its democratic institutions. In Morocco and Jordan, the governments were responding to largely non-violent protests by making concessions, achieving a semblance of equilibrium and new balance, allowing for more gradual, rather than revolutionary, path to reforms. In Egypt, the January Revolution was met with successive counter-revolutionary efforts. First, a military government in 2011 and 12, then an elected Muslim Brotherhood president and government, and finally, a second army-dominated government after the 2013 coup that, with popular support, removed the president and dissolved parliament. When it comes to parliaments, in most of the countries of the Arab world, there is still a predominance of the executive power over the legislature. However, the parliaments in essence managed to consolidate the exercise of their core functions, to pass the legislation, to oversee the implementation, and to represent the citizens. They also became indispensable institutions of governance. Elections became unavoidable in most of the cases. Looking only back 30 years ago, this was not the case. Executive was dominating even the legislative work by passing legislation and ruling by decree. If nothing else, this solely represents a quantitative leap of parliamentary development in the region. You have listened to the 5th episode of the podcast Parliaments Through Time, where we explore the parliamentary development in the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab Spring. In the next episode, we will address the issue of parliamentary powers in emergency situations. Stay tuned and stay safe.